Please join me in the prayer for illumination. Open our ears, O God, that we may hear your word proclaimed this day. Open our minds and hearts to be changed. Teach us, Lord, that we may follow you more faithfully. Amen.
So on this second Sunday of Easter, we continue the story in chapter 24 of Luke's Gospel. If you remember last Sunday, Jesus was a no-show on Easter morning. Luke didn't have any appearance of him in those first 12 verses. The empty tomb really was empty, and Jesus in the story so far has yet to appear. We heard the women go and testify, witness to what they had seen there, that he is risen. And the men, the apostles, do not believe, and Peter runs to the tomb to see what is going on. And that brings us to our story for this morning, about two disciples on the road to a village named Emmaus. For Luke, it seems that we need to be on the road, on the move, to take a journey in order to encounter Jesus. And we see that again in our story this morning. So as I said, Lynn and I are going to tag team on this reading. You can follow along if you'd like in the bulletin insert.
On that first Easter morning, 2 disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened.
While they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on their journey. They were prevented from recognizing him. Jesus said to them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" They stopped, their faces downcast.
The one named Cleopas replied, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have taken place there over the last few days?"
He said to them, "What things?"
They said to him, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth. Because of his powerful deeds and words, he was recognized by God and all the people as a prophet. But our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. All these things happened 3 days ago."
But there's more. Some women from our group have just left us stunned. They went to the tomb early this morning and they didn't find his body. They came to us saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who told them that he is alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women said. They didn't see him.
Then Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, so slow of heart to believe all that the prophets spoken. Wasn't it necessary for the Messiah to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?"
Then he interpreted for them the many things written about himself in all the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets.
When they came to Emmaus, he acted as if he was going on ahead. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening, and the day is almost over." So he went in and stayed with them.
After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Their eyes were open and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight.
They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road and when he explained the scriptures for us?"
They got up right then and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, "The Lord has risen. He appeared to Simon."
Then the 2 disciples described what had happened along the road and how Jesus had made known to them as he broke the bread.
Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Aaron Jackson is a photo editor for the Associated Press, but way back in the year 2001, he was a photographer living in New York City, and he was one of many journalists who were sent in to chronicle the destruction after the 9/11 event. And even though the buildings had collapsed more than a week earlier, there was still fire and smoke arising from the site of the destruction there in New York City. As Jackson walks along, he was capturing image after image of the destruction. And by chance, he happened to notice something that literally made him fall to his knees. You see, for more than 3 decades, the sidewalks surrounding the Twin Towers had been in shadow. But after their collapse, the sun was able to shine on the concrete landscape as never before. And he noticed that there in the crack of one of the sidewalks was the smallest of dandelion blooms. When he saw it, he had a kind of epiphany. He realized that death would not get the last word, even in this most destructive of events, that life would somehow find a way. And as he knelt down to touch the flower, a flower that we actually call a weed and we try to rid ourselves of, he saw that that little bloom in the crack of the city sidewalk, he was overwhelmed by a sense of revelation. This revelation that God is present in all the circumstances of life. And so with images of destruction and death all around him, he began to take pictures of the new life that was springing up in the most unexpected place. So amid the brokenness of that haunted place of death, he was seeing resurrection in a way he had never seen before. In many ways, the Gospels in the stories of Jesus' appearance after Easter are telling the same kind of story that Aaron Jackson saw that day after 9/11. It's how the resurrection becomes real for the disciples, because in many ways it is not yet real on that first visit on Easter morning. And for Luke, as we hear, it does not happen at the empty tomb there in the garden, but rather on the hard and dusty road of disappointment. In our story that we hear this morning, the 2 disciples are on their way, seemingly out of town, perhaps back home. The resurrection has not yet become real for them, and it seems that the Easter promise has been broken. And I think it's interesting to note that the place that they're traveling to, the town or the city of Emmaus, remains a mystery to us. We are not sure where this particular town was or is today. So in effect, some say they were on the road to nowhere with no hope for the future. Luke doesn't tell us much about these 2 disciples. He lets us know that one of them is named Cleopas, and that the other, some speculate, perhaps was his wife, that they were traveling along together after the Easter event. But we're told nothing else about them other that they're saddened, that they're crestfallen, that they cannot find any hope in what has happened. And of course it's for good reason, because their master and their teacher, Jesus, the one who they thought would bring liberation to Israel, has been crucified like a common criminal, and they have seen him dead and laid in a tomb. They've seen him, of course, perform miracles, perhaps heal the sick. They've heard his teachings, but it seems that Jesus was not able to save himself. So instead of miracles, what they find is a loss of hope. They find death and destruction and seemingly nothing more. It is a long and dusty road of defeat that they take, returning perhaps back home. The poet T.S. Eliot, in his poem The Wasteland, I think captures this particular moment very well. He writes this: "After the torchlight on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the garden, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying. That seems to be the despair and the disappointment and the hopelessness of this moment. The late theologian and writer Henry Nouwen wrote a wonderful little book. It's called With Burning Hearts, and it's a meditation on the life of the Eucharist, of communion, but it's really based around this story of the road to Emmaus. And Nouwen insists that these two strange and mysterious figures on the road represent all of us who follow Jesus. The disciples stand in for all of us who have suffered disappointment and loss, for those of us who know grief and despair. Here's what he writes. He says, "In many ways we are like them because we too are lost, aren't we? We have all lost so much. Sometimes it seems that life itself is just one long series of losses. When we were born, we lost the safety of the womb. When we went to school, we lost the security of family life. When we got our first job, we lost the freedom of our youth. When we grew old, we lost our good looks." I'm not so sure about that. There's some good-looking folks around, but I'm just quoting the author. When we became weak and ill, he says, we lose our physical independence. We know what that's like, don't we? And when we die, he said, it seems that we lose it all. The losses settle themselves deeply in our hearts and our minds, but perhaps the one that we most miss is the loss of intimacy, the loss of innocence, and the loss of love, the loss of our dreams. And yet, Nouwen writes, it's in the midst of this particular vulnerable and most human of moments when these two sojourners encounter Jesus on the road. Of course, we know who it is, even though he remains unrecognized to these two. We know who's on the road as they travel. And we hear Jesus begin with a question about what is going on and a word of challenge about their faith. But then gently he leads them through their own scriptures, reminding them of Moses and of the prophets, helping them to remember the story of their faith and to see it more clearly. And then, as if the words are not quite enough, Jesus offers an act of hospitality as he sits down at the table and he breaks the bread, and suddenly their eyes are opened and they see clearly again who he is. And so it's at that dinner table, in that act of communion of Eucharist, of the taking and the breaking of the bread and the blessing of it, that he is revealed. And suddenly we see that the tears and the fear of the disciples is wiped away. The grief that they had now turns into hope. The fear transforms into courage, and they jump up and they go running back to Jerusalem that they have just left to share the good news of what they have seen. The story reminds us that as we gather in worship after Easter on this second Sunday, that each of us is on our own post-Easter journey, that in our own faith we too see disappointment, we know despair, we know death. Frederick Buechner, the late Presbyterian minister and novelist, wrote this. He said, "It's the sacred moments, the moments of miracle that are often everyday moments, the moments which, if you do not look with more than your eyes or listen with more than your ears, reveal only a gardener or a stranger coming down the road or a meal like any other. But he says, if we look with our hearts, if we listen with all of our being and with all of our imagination, then what we just might see is Jesus himself joining us." And so Luke is telling us that as long as we keep moving along on the road of faith, that we can expect to hear a voice speaking to us, a voice that sometimes is encouraging and reminding us, a voice sometimes challenging and pushing us in a new direction, but always inviting us to remain faithful and obedient to the gospel. I'll close with a story that was told by the child psychologist and author Robert Coles. You may know him for his famous book, The Story of Ruby Bridges. But he was actually he's still alive at 95 years old. He was a prize-winning author, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for his book called The Spiritual Life of Children, where he went and interviewed children across the country and from all different spectrums of life to begin to understand their faith and their spiritual life. And one particular girl he interviewed was a girl named Ginny. She came from a poor family, but she was bright and articulate and imaginative, had a very well-developed sense of spirituality and of God. One day, Ginny was walking home from school, she tells Coles, and along the way, she encountered an elderly woman who seemed lost and confused. Ginny asked the woman if she needed any help, and with relief, she said, "Yes, if you could help, that would be wonderful." She soon discovered that the woman was out walking and trying to make her way to her daughter's house, but had lost her way. She was disoriented and did not know where to go. She showed Ginny the written directions that her daughter had given her, and she knew immediately how to get her to her daughter's house. Although Ginny was now late getting home for her chores, she sensed that somehow helping this troubled stranger to her destination was a chore, a job that was more important than any other at that moment. And so she walked along with the woman, guiding her gently, listening to her as she spoke about her own life and what was going on, and finally guided her safely to her daughter's house. When they arrived and Ginny turned to leave, the woman grasped her arm, and she announced that she was sure that God had sent Ginny to her. She promised her later that before she went to sleep, she would pray and give thanks to God that Ginny was there. And then the woman leaned over and gave her a kiss. On her way home, Ginny said later in an interview, she wondered herself what it would be like to be old. She wondered what it would be like to be old and in need of God, and if God would send someone like her, a kid, to help her out. Maybe God puts you there, Ginny said, and gives you hints of what's ahead, and you should pay attention to them, because that's Him speaking to you. I think that's what our story this morning is also about. In this after Easter journey that we are all on, we're invited to listen for those hints of what's ahead. Not always obvious, not always in those magical and miraculous moments, but in the mundane things of life. After all, Easter is much more than an empty tomb. It's about a companion who comes among us and walks along the road of disappointment and despair. It's the one who comes and sits in our midst and is the guest at our table. It is our host and our friend who will not abandon us. And so, friends, whatever road you happen to be walking on this week, whatever circumstances of life you may be living out, our hope and our prayer today is that the risen one is at your side, that we are not left alone, and that God continues to walk with us. And so, friends, to God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.